He had imagined her small and delicate, with gentle hands that would tend his garden and soft words that would fill the silence of his lonely ranch. But when the dust settled from the wagon wheels, Jacob Miller found himself staring up at a woman who could probably lift him with one arm. Sarah Blake stood 6 feet tall in her worn boots, with shoulders broader than most men in town and hands that looked like they could handle a plow better than a teacup. The letter in his pocket suddenly felt like a cruel joke, and the wedding ring he had carved from oak seemed impossibly small. 3 months earlier, Jacob had placed his advertisement in the territorial newspaper with shaking hands. Honest rancher seeks gentle companion for frontier life, must appreciate simple pleasures and quiet evenings. He had received only one response written in careful script that spoke of loneliness matching his own. Sarah's letters had painted pictures of cozy meals and shared conversations of someone who understood the weight of solitude that pressed down on isolated homesteads. Never once had she mentioned that she stood taller than his barn door. Marcus Cooper, the merchant who had arranged the meeting, cleared his throat nervously as he climbed down from the wagon driver's seat. His eyes darted between Jacob's stunned expression and Sarah's imposing figure. The woman herself seemed equally surprised, her confident posture faltering as she took in Jacob's slight frame and the way he had to crane his neck to meet her gaze. For a moment, the three of them stood frozen in the dusty yard like actors who had forgotten their lines. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Jacob felt the curious stares of his neighbors who had gathered to witness the arrival of his mail-order bride. Mrs. Parker from the general store whispered something to her husband behind her hand. Young Billy Carter actually pointed before his mother, yanked his arm down. The whole scene felt like a public spectacle gone wrong, and Jacob's cheeks burned with embarrassment that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. Sarah finally spoke, her voice deeper than he had expected, but not unkind. "You must be Jacob." She extended a hand that engulfed his own when he reluctantly offered it. Her grip was firm but careful, as if she was aware of her own strength. "I suppose we should talk." The way she said it suggested she was having the same doubts that were racing through his mind. Marcus Cooper sensed the tension and quickly busied himself unloading Sarah's single trunk from the wagon bed. It was larger than Jacob had anticipated, reinforcing the growing realization that nothing about this arrangement was going to match his expectations. The merchant's hurried movements betrayed his own discomfort with the awkward situation he had helped create. But as Jacob watched Sarah survey his modest ranch with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than disappointment, something unexpected happened. She didn't wrinkle her nose at the simple cabin or the patches in the corral fence. Instead, she nodded approvingly at his well-tended vegetable garden and the neat stack of firewood by the porch. Whatever shock she felt at his appearance, she was keeping it to herself with a grace he hadn't expected from someone who looked like she could break him in half. The morning after Sarah's arrival brought a crisis that neither of them had anticipated. Jacob's prize bull, Dakota, had somehow broken through the reinforced fence during the night and was now standing defiantly in the middle of Mrs. Parker's prized flower garden, 3 properties over. The massive animal was systematically destroying months of careful cultivation, and the sound of Mrs. Parker's furious shouting could be heard clear across the valley. Jacob stood at his porch railing, wringing his hands as he watched the disaster unfold. Dakota weighed nearly 2,000 pounds and had the temperament of a storm cloud on the best of days. The bull had already charged 2 of the neighbor men who had tried to approach, sending them scrambling over fences in undignified retreat. The situation was quickly becoming the kind of neighborhood scandal that would follow Jacob for years. "You can't rope him from here," Sarah observed calmly from beside him. She had appeared at his elbow without him noticing, moving with surprising quiet for someone her size. Her eyes were fixed on the bull with an expression that Jacob couldn't quite read. "And those men down there are going to get themselves trampled if they keep approaching from the front like that." Jacob nodded miserably. Dakota's always been stubborn, but never like this. I don't know what got into him. The truth was, he had been dreading this exact scenario since the day he bought the bull. He had neither the physical strength nor the experience to handle such a large animal when it decided to be uncooperative. Most of his neighbors knew it, which made the current situation even more humiliating. Without warning, Sarah stepped off the porch and began walking toward the chaos with long, purposeful strides. Jacob hurried after her, his shorter legs working double time to keep up. "Sarah, wait. He's dangerous when he's agitated like this. You shouldn't." But she was already halfway across the field, her attention focused entirely on the rampaging bull. As they approached Mrs. Parker's property, Jacob could see the full extent of the damage. Roses that had taken 3 years to establish were trampled into the dirt. The carefully arranged border stones had been scattered like toys. Mrs. Parker herself stood on her front steps, her face red with fury, directing a stream of accusations at anyone within earshot. When she spotted Jacob approaching, her voice rose another octave. "That monster of yours has destroyed everything," she shrieked. "Look at my garden, just look at it. You're going to pay for every single plant, Jacob Miller, and if you can't control your livestock, you have no business keeping them." The other neighbors nodded in agreement, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to openly hostile. Sarah ignored the commotion entirely. She studied Dakota's movements with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for reading difficult text. The bull was pawing the ground near what remained of a rosebush, his massive head lowered in a way that suggested he was preparing for another charge. 2 more men had arrived with ropes, but they stood at a safe distance, clearly reluctant to get within range of those wicked-looking horns. Then Sarah did something that made Jacob's heart stop. She climbed over the fence and began walking directly toward the agitated animal, her hands empty and her movements slow but confident. The crowd fell silent, watching in fascination and horror as this impossibly tall woman approached the beast that had sent grown men running for cover. Even Mrs. Parker stopped her tirade, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. Dakota's massive head swung toward Sarah as she approached, his nostrils flaring with each heavy breath. The bull's eyes rolled wide at the edges, a sure sign of an animal pushed beyond reason. Jacob felt his throat constrict as he watched his mail-order bride walk calmly into what looked like certain death. Every instinct screamed at him to call out, to stop her, but something in her deliberate movements kept him frozen in place. Sarah began speaking to the bull in a low, steady voice that carried just far enough for Jacob to catch fragments. She wasn't using the sharp, commanding tone most people employed with livestock. Instead, her words flowed like water over stones, rhythmic and soothing. Dakota's ears twitched forward, and his pawing gradually slowed. The crowd of onlookers held their collective breath as woman and beast regarded each other across 10 feet of trampled garden. "Easy there, big fellow," Sarah murmured, extending one hand palm up in Dakota's direction. "You're not really angry, are you? Just confused and far from home." She took another step closer, and Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs. The bull could charge at any moment, and there was nowhere for her to run in Mrs. Parker's enclosed garden space. But Dakota didn't charge. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The massive animal's breathing began to even out, and his aggressive posture relaxed incrementally. Sarah continued her approach, never breaking eye contact, never hurrying her movements. When she was close enough to touch him, she reached out and placed her hand on his enormous neck right behind his left ear. The effect was immediate and startling. Dakota's head dropped lower, and a sound that was almost like a sigh escaped from his chest. Sarah began scratching behind his ear with practiced fingers, and the bull actually leaned into her touch like an oversized dog seeking affection. The transformation was so complete that several people in the crowd gasped audibly. "Someone fetch a lead rope," Sarah called over her shoulder without taking her eyes off Dakota. Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Marcus Cooper scrambled to comply, returning quickly with a length of sturdy rope from Jacob's barn. Sarah fashioned a simple halter with movements so smooth they seemed rehearsed. Within minutes, she was leading Dakota out of the ruined garden as docilely as a lamb. The bull followed her without resistance, his earlier aggression completely forgotten. The assembled neighbors parted like water before them, their faces showing a mixture of amazement and bewilderment. Mrs. Parker stood speechless on her porch steps, her prepared speech about livestock control dying unspoken on her lips. As they passed Jacob, Sarah caught his eye and offered a small smile that transformed her entire face. For the first time since her arrival, he saw past her intimidating size to something warmer underneath. "Your fence has a weak post on the north corner," she said casually, as if taming rampaging bulls was something she did every morning before breakfast. "We should probably fix that before he decides to take another walk." Word of Sarah's feat with the bull spread through the settlement faster than wildfire and dry grass. By afternoon, a steady stream of neighbors had found excuses to visit Jacob's ranch, their curiosity barely concealed behind offers of welcome meals and gardening advice. Each visitor cast furtive glances at Sarah as she worked alongside Jacob to repair the damaged fence, their whispered conversations creating an undercurrent of speculation that made him increasingly uncomfortable. The attention reached a peak when Robert Hayes arrived with his 3 sons in tow, ostensibly to help with the fence work, but clearly more interested in getting a closer look at the woman who had tamed Dakota with her bare hands. Hayes was the kind of man who measured everything by physical strength and found Jacob lacking in most departments. His presence always made Jacob feel smaller than he already was. "Heard your lady friend has a way with livestock," Hayes commented, leaning against the fence post with studied casualness. His boys arranged themselves behind him like an audience, their eyes fixed on Sarah as she drove fence posts into the hard ground with powerful swings of a heavy sledgehammer. Each blow sent the post deeper than Jacob could have managed with twice as many swings. Jacob felt heat creep up his neck as Hayes's implications became clear. The man was questioning whether Jacob could provide for and protect a woman of Sarah's obvious capabilities. It was the same doubt that had been gnawing at his own confidence since her arrival, but hearing it voiced by someone else made it sting twice as sharp. "Sarah grew up on a cattle ranch in Montana," Jacob replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "She knows her way around animals." It was true as far as it went, though he had learned this fact only that morning when she mentioned it while examining Dakota's temperament. Her letters had spoken of wanting a quiet life, but they had never detailed the experiences that had shaped her into someone capable of handling a 2,000-pound bull without breaking a sweat. Hayes's eldest son, a strapping young man of 19, stepped forward with the kind of confidence that came from never having been physically challenged by life. "Maybe she'd like some help with that post hole digger," he offered, his voice carrying the assumption that his assistance would be both welcome and necessary. "Looks like heavy work for," he trailed off, apparently realizing that commenting on Sarah's gender might not be wise, given what they had all witnessed that morning. Sarah looked up from her work, sweat glistening on her forehead, despite the relatively cool temperature. Her expression was polite but distant as she considered the young man's offer. "I appreciate the thought," she said, "but I've got my rhythm now. Might be better if you helped Jacob with stretching the wire." Her tone was perfectly pleasant, but there was something in it that discouraged further offers of assistance. The rejection stung the boy's pride in a way that was immediately visible. His shoulders stiffened and his jaw clenched as he realized that this unusual woman had no need for his strength or protection. Hayes's other sons exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their collective confusion regarding the proper social dynamics of the situation. Jacob watched the interaction with growing unease. He could see the wheels turning in Hayes's head, the calculations being made about power and perception and community standing. Men like Hayes lived by clear rules about who was strong and who was weak, who led and who followed. Sarah's presence disrupted those rules in ways that made some people uncomfortable. But what troubled Jacob most was his own reaction. Part of him was proud of Sarah's competence and independence. Another part wondered if her strength highlighted his own inadequacies in ways that would become impossible to ignore. That evening, as the last of the curious neighbors finally departed, Jacob found himself alone with Sarah for the first time since her arrival. The silence between them felt heavier than the humid air that preceded a thunderstorm. They sat on opposite ends of his small porch. The space between them measured not just in feet, but in the weight of unspoken doubts and mismatched expectations. Sarah broke the silence first, her voice carrying a weariness that hadn't been there when she faced down the bull. "This isn't what either of us expected, is it?" She wasn't looking at him as she spoke, but rather staring out at the darkening horizon where the first stars were beginning to appear. Her profile was strong and angular, nothing like the delicate features he had imagined during those long months of correspondence. Jacob shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the wood creaking under his slight weight. "I should have been more specific in my letters," he admitted, though even as he said it, he wasn't sure what exactly he could have written. That he was smaller than most men, that he sometimes felt lost on his own ranch, that he had placed the advertisement not out of confidence, but out of desperate loneliness. About what? Sarah turned to face him, and her directness caught him off guard. About being shorter than average, about having neighbors who measure a man's worth by how much weight he can lift. There was no mockery in her voice, but there was a sharp understanding that made Jacob wonder what experiences had taught her to recognize such things so quickly. The honesty in her question demanded an equally honest response about feeling like "I'm not enough." He said quietly, "Not strong enough, not big enough, not man enough for this life I'm trying to build." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. accurate and impossible to take back. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming a slow rhythm against the arm of her chair. When she finally spoke, her voice held a gentleness that surprised him. "You know what I saw today when you watched me with Dakota?" She didn't wait for his answer. "I saw a man who cared more about my safety than his own embarrassment. Most men would have stopped me, would have insisted on handling it themselves, even if they got hurt in the process." Jacob felt something loosen in his chest, though he wasn't sure if it was relief or something more complicated. "And what I should have written," Sarah continued, "was that I'm tired of being seen as a curiosity or a challenge. That I've spent my whole life having people assume I must be looking for someone to prove their strength against mine." The revelation shifted something fundamental in how Jacob saw their situation. All day, he had been focused on what he lacked, on how he didn't measure up to some imagined standard. But Sarah's words suggested that she had her own burdens to carry, her own reasons for seeking a life away from the judgments of others. "So what do we do now?" he asked, genuine curiosity replacing the anxiety that had plagued him since her arrival. Sarah reached into her dress pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper that looked worn from repeated handling. "Do you remember what you wrote in your third letter?" she asked, unfolding it carefully in the dim porch light. "You said that you believed real partnership meant two people making each other stronger, not one person making the other feel smaller." Jacob did remember writing those words, though they had seemed almost foolishly idealistic when he penned them by lamplight months ago. He had worried that such sentiment might drive away potential respondents who expected more traditional arrangements. Now hearing them quoted back to him, they sounded like a promise he wasn't sure he knew how to keep. "I meant it when I wrote it," he said slowly, "but I'm not sure I understood what it would look like in practice." He gestured toward the fence they had repaired together, where her competence had been, so evident beside his own struggles. "Today made me realize how much I don't know about my own land, my own animals." Sarah refolded the letter and tucked it away, but not before Jacob caught sight of other papers in her pocket. More of his letters, he realized, kept and apparently reread enough to show where. The thought that his words had been important enough to preserve gave him an unexpected surge of something that might have been hope. "You know what I noticed today?" Sarah asked, shifting in her chair to face him more directly. "When Dakota got loose. You didn't run to get help from Hayes or any of the other men. You came to find me. That tells me something about who you are when the pretenses fall away." Jacob hadn't thought about his actions in those terms, but she was right. When crisis struck, his instinct had been to turn to her, not because he expected her to solve his problems, but because somehow he had sensed that she would understand what needed to be done. It was a level of trust that surprised him, given how recently they had met. "In my last letter," Sarah continued, "I wrote that I was tired of being alone. But I didn't just mean physically alone. I meant being alone with my thoughts, my struggles, my dreams for what life could be like if I found the right person to share it with." She paused, studying his face in the gathering darkness. "I think maybe we both advertise for someone to rescue us from loneliness. But what we might actually need is someone to be lonely with sometimes and strong with other times." The distinction she was drawing felt important, though Jacob wasn't entirely sure he grasped all its implications. Traditional marriage arrangements in their community seemed to follow predictable patterns. The man provided protection and resources. The woman provided domestic skills and companionship. What Sarah was suggesting sounded more complex and more honest than those familiar roles. "So, we try," he said finally. "We try to figure out what partnership looks like when it doesn't fit the usual patterns." It wasn't a question, but Sarah nodded anyway, her expression serious, but not without warmth. "But first," she said, standing and brushing dust from her skirt, "you're going to show me how you plan to propose because technically, we're still just two strangers who happen to be sharing a porch." Her tone was light, but there was something in her eyes that suggested the formality mattered to her more than she was letting on. Jacob felt his pulse quicken as he realized she was right. In all the confusion and awkwardness of her arrival, they had never actually addressed the fundamental question of whether they wanted to proceed with marriage. Jacob's hands trembled slightly as he reached into his vest pocket and withdrew the small wooden box he had been carrying since dawn. Inside lay the ring he had carved from a piece of oak that had fallen during last winter's storms, its surface polished smooth by hours of careful work. It was simple and unadorned, nothing like the gold bands that wealthier men could afford, but he had poured months of hope into its creation. "I had planned to do this properly," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "To wait until after we had talked, until I was sure you weren't disappointed by." He gestured vaguely at himself, at the modest ranch, at everything that wasn't what she might have expected. Sarah stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the honest scent of hard work on her clothes and see the genuine curiosity in her eyes as she looked at the ring. "May I?" she asked, extending her hand toward the box. When he nodded, she lifted the ring carefully, turning it in the moonlight to examine the grain of the wood and the smooth finish he had achieved. "You made this yourself," she said. And it wasn't a question. Her voice held a note of something that might have been wonder. "How long did it take?" As she spoke, she slipped the ring onto her finger, testing the fit. It was too small, as Jacob had feared it would be, stopping at her second knuckle instead of sliding home. 3 months, Jacob admitted, his heart sinking as he watched the ring refuse to fit properly. "I started it the day after I received your first letter." The failure of something so basic felt like a metaphor for everything that had gone wrong since her arrival. He had imagined her hands as delicate, had carved the ring to match his fantasy rather than reality. But instead of disappointment, Sarah's face showed something entirely unexpected. She smiled, a real smile that transformed her features completely. 3 months, she repeated softly. "You spent 3 months making something for a woman you had never met based on nothing but letters and hope." She looked down at the ring, still perched on her knuckle. "Do you know what that tells me about who you are?" Jacob shook his head, not trusting his voice. The evening had already contained more emotional honesty than he typically experienced in a month, and he felt wrung out by the intensity of it all. "It tells me you're someone who believes in taking care with important things," Sarah said. "Someone who puts thought and effort into making something beautiful, even when no one is watching to judge your work." She slipped the ring off her finger and held it up between them. "And someone practical enough to know that rings can be resized, but character cannot." The simple statement hit Jacob with unexpected force. All day he had been focused on physical inadequacies, on measurements and comparisons that seemed to matter so much to everyone around them. But Sarah was suggesting that there were other ways to measure worth, other kinds of strength that might matter more in the long run. "So, is that a yes?" he asked, the question coming out more uncertain than he had intended. Sarah's answer came not in words, but in action. She took Jacob's hands in her own larger ones and placed the wooden ring in his palm, then guided his hands to close around it. "Ask me properly," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Not because you think you should or because we made an arrangement through letters, but because you want to." Jacob looked up into her face, really seeing her for the first time since she had stepped off Marcus Cooper's wagon. Yes, she was taller and stronger than he had expected, but there was also a kindness in her eyes that hadn't come through in their written correspondence. There was intelligence there and humor and something that looked suspiciously like affection despite their brief acquaintance. "Sarah Blake," he said, his voice growing steadier with each word. "Will you marry me? Not because of letters or arrangements or what other people expect, but because I think we might be able to build something good together, something neither of us could build alone." "Yes," she said simply, and the word hung in the evening air between them like a promise. "But I have conditions." The addition made Jacob's stomach tighten, but her expression remained warm. "I want us to resize this ring together. I want to learn how to work with wood, and I want you to teach me. And I want you to let me teach you about cattle and horses and all the things I know that might be useful here." The relief that flooded through Jacob was so intense it almost made him lightheaded. Her conditions weren't demands for him to change who he was, but invitations to share knowledge and skills. "I'd like that," he said. "All of it." 6 months later, as autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Jacob and Sarah stood before their neighbors in the small community church. The wooden ring, now properly sized and accompanied by a matching band Sarah had carved for Jacob, sat snugly on her finger. Their partnership had proven as unconventional as their first meeting, but it had also proven effective. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Jacob's careful attention to detail, paired with Sarah's physical strength and animal expertise, had transformed the modest homestead into one of the most productive in the area. Dakota, now properly contained by reinforced fencing, had sired several calves that promised to be as impressive as their father, but considerably more manageable. More importantly, Jacob had discovered that strength came in many forms. While he might never match Sarah's ability to wrestle a stubborn bull or split fence posts with a single swing, his patience and methodical approach had taught her the value of planning ahead and thinking through problems before attacking them with brute force. The whispers and speculation of their neighbors had gradually given way to respect and even a touch of envy. Other couples in the community had begun to notice how Jacob and Sarah worked together, how they consulted each other on decisions, how they seemed to genuinely enjoy each other's company, even during the mundane tasks of daily life. As they spoke their vows that crisp October morning, Jacob caught sight of Robert Hayes in the congregation. The man who had once questioned Jacob's ability to provide for such a woman now nodded approvingly as the couple promised to honor and support each other through whatever challenges lay ahead. The mail-order bride arrangement that had brought them together was forgotten, now replaced by something much more valuable. A partnership built on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and the kind of love that grew from truly seeing and accepting another person exactly as they were. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where unexpected encounters change everything in the wild frontier. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.